Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the African Esquire show on WCC TV. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie. I'm sorry we're getting started at an awkward time today. I was actually completely ready to go at 8 a.m. With all my articles. And then when I opened my computer, I realized that I did not save, which is something that's very important to do in this modern age, is to remember to save, because sometimes it backs up and sometimes it doesn't. So I had to look for all of the articles and all the videos I was going to play for today all over again. So that's why we're getting started at this time today. Also, just an FYI, if you remember last week, I did a video where I said that my son was sick or under the weather. And of course, I caught his cold. So if I sound nasally, that's why. And then if I have to take a break, I would just, take myself off camera for a moment. But I think I should be able to plow through this. It's not going to be too long of a video. It's going to be an issue that we have talked about before, but I think it's going to have a new lens with this whole Ukrainian refugee asylum seeker crisis that's going on right now, and the response that the international community has had to this, as opposed to the response that Africans have received whenever they have been fleeing the conflicts that are really caused by the colonial system. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get into it, as always, I want to share our website, We Charge Colonialism. WeChargeColonialism.org is our website. A lot of important information there. Thank you to everyone who has been donating here. I'm going to compile all the names of people who have donated, just to give you thank yous. I know a lot of people don't want to be recognized, but it's always appreciated. And we appreciate every single cent that every single person gives. But you can find our beliefs, why we are here, what we do. You can find also articles that we've written. The last article that's on our website, Kenya and KFC Neocolonialism in Full Effect, that was written by our brother Jamal, who is actually based in Kenya right now. So if you want to hear about what he has observed in Kenya, you could click that. Also, this is my previous article that I've written, Colonial Constitutions, about South Africa. Why is it that South Africa will never give land back to the indigenous population? I've heard it's kind of a not too optimistic article, but it's intentionally not optimistic because we shouldn't have optimism when it comes to the colonial system. When it comes to the globalist system, we should understand that it's operating at a certain way because it's intended to. So that's really what we talk about in that article. And then also, very important, I'm always going to remind you all, we have an important convention coming in July 2022, and it's going to be the 21st to the 22nd. It's based out of Zimbabwe, so it's going to be hosted from Zimbabwe, and the theme is Pan-African Unity or Perish, a call for the abolition of neocolonialism. We talk about colonialism all the time. This is an opportunity for us to really get into it. What is it that we're trying to call for? What needs to happen for African people? And why is colonialism the thing that we should be focused on? That's really a big thing about that. You can register right here at this button right here for Women's History. I think it's Women's History Month, apparently. I know yesterday was Women's Day, but there's a promo code WOMEN. If you enter that, you will get, I think it's 15% off. Don't quote me. Go to the website and enter the promo code, and you should be able to get a discount. So with that, let me check the comments, see how everyone's doing. Good morning, everyone. Yes, we're feeling better. It's just, at this point, it's a little nasally, but thank you all for your concern. And we're going to get into it. So the reason I wanted to talk about this subject is because we know certain things already. Let's be very clear. I mean, sometimes we talk about things about how the Europeans treat African people, and all of us are very well aware of how this system works by now. If you're not, I encourage you, go back. I have 4 years worth of videos at this point, talking about colonialism, talking about the European system, talking about racism. Just go back and watch, and you will see over time that wherever I'm talking about, whatever story I'm covering, whatever region, there's some themes. The theme is that African people, our lives, our children's lives, women's lives, our elders' lives, whatever, are not going to be prioritized, are not going to be dignified. And we're not really looked at as fully human. We're looked at as subhuman. This is something that has been the case since we have encountered the transatlantic slave trade. And that was our first stint of colonialism up until today. So we know this, we expect this. I hope you expect this. If you don't expect it, you have to get on it, because the system has shown us many times how inhumane they are towards African people. But the issue I have is that whenever the African community kind of turns off our radar when it comes to these things, and one, we express amazement or surprise whenever things like this happen, whenever we see African migrants being mistreated. And another thing is that a lot of times we are so willing to overly express sympathy towards some people while our own people are suffering way worse. And it's not to say that you can only care about your people, but when your people are suffering to the degree that African people are suffering, when your people are suffering so much to the degree that they are willing to get on a little floaty raft and go in the Mediterranean for the hope that maybe you can reach Europe and maybe you can have a better life for yourself, that's a real problem. That's a real huge problem that our people are facing, and we're not being awakened to the reality of what is happening to our people. So let's just recap a little bit about what's going on with the Ukrainian refugees, and we're going to draw a parallel from that to what's been happening. This is not new. What's been happening with African people who have been fleeing colonialism, fleeing the African continent that is their home, in an effort to get away from the oppression that they are facing because they're under colonial control. So I'm going to go to just the video. Let's just see how Ukrainians are being treated when it comes to their refugees who are fleeing.
The humanitarian emergency playing out on Ukraine's borders. More than 2 million refugees now in less than 2 weeks since this all started. More than 1 million refugees in Poland alone. And tonight, Marcus Moore takes us to the Polish countryside and what our team witnessed.
Tonight, the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. The UN saying the emergency is growing at an alarming rate. More than 2 million people fleeing Ukraine in less than 2 weeks.
This is the busy border crossing into Poland, and you can see the families boarding the buses. What officials here are most concerned about is that as these waves of refugees continue to come to the border here, many of them will have no place to go, and this humanitarian crisis will only worsen.
More than 1.2 million people have arrived to Poland. We caught up with Maxim Harbers at a reception center. He and his wife have been giving refugee families shelter in the Polish countryside.
Today
I'm going to cover this again more, but I want you to remember Poland. You know, Poland's one of the countries we're going to talk about later in the video, because it's interesting whenever you see the treatment of Ukrainian refugees coming from Poland as opposed to African people who are fleeing conflict. So just wanted to throw that in there.
have free 3 rooms because another people going to another countries.
Reza, her mother and 2 kids are among those families. They traveled for 2 days from Kyiv.
Where will you go from here?
I don't know.
For now, she's relying on the kindness of strangers. Just days ago, we traveled to the Harbors family wedding venue and hotel. It's been transformed into a lifeline for families forced from their homes.
Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they can come to us. We will give them.
So far, they've helped more than 20 families.
If we will don't do that, then where these families will go?
With the children eager to learn.
So you can kind of get the sense of how the response has been as far as the Ukrainian refugees. You see brotherhood, you see you see people who are willing to do things that go against their own advantage in order to help people that they identify with or who they see themselves in. And because of that, you have a Polish country or other countries, really the whole world, really opening their borders to Ukrainians. And when I say the whole world, I mean, even not that, Ukrainians are trying to flee to Africa, but for example, I think it was Morocco, I believe, or another African country around that region, that they actually said to Ukrainian refugees no, not refugees, Ukrainian tourists. So, because I guess it's a big tourist destination for them, that you guys can stay if you want. So it's not even just Europeans, it's Africans who are opening up their borders. It's obviously people all throughout the world who are trying to basically come to the aid of these people who are definitely fleeing conflict, and we don't negate that. I mean, bombs coming at in your neighborhood, that's definitely conflict. But let's see if this same thing is reciprocated for African people. I'm sure you all already know the answer to that. So let's look at this is a by the way, if you're weak stomach, if you don't like seeing grotesque things, and I don't, but I force myself to when it comes to what's happening with our people, because this is really what's happening. We have to understand the gravity of it. But you might want to turn away for some of this video because it's very graphic. But it paints the picture of the disparity in treatment that we receive inside of this international system, this human rights system, this system that's supposed to be for all humankind. It shows just how desperate the conditions are. So I'm going to play this video.
Air-conditioned bubble of the summit in the desert. For European leaders, all fighting off populist challenges at home, triggered by the migration crisis, this meeting was above all about one issue.
I want to acknowledge and salute all those here who have shouldered the burden of population.
To catch the migrants and keep them. In the past, NGO ships like this one would rescue drowning migrants and transport them to Europe, where they were welcomed until the political climate changed. The populist government in Italy has refused to let these rescue ships dock. The new policy is to fund the Libyan Coast Guard with ships and training to fish the migrants and refugees out of the sea and send them back to Libya. It has worked. The Libyan route has been virtually shut down, but at a terrible human cost, in which European leaders with their domestic concerns are complicit.
No more suffer. No more suffer. No more suffer.
These are mainly Eritreans, arms crossed, symbolizing a demand for freedom. They once dreamt of safety in Europe, but instead they've ended up detained in Libya, caught up in a nightmare the world is unaware of and Europe has turned a blind eye to.
They're all locked in together. They don't see sunlight.
Detention center in the town of Kums, just east of Tripoli, the beginning of a chilling crime. These Eritrean men are furious after discovering that some of their friends were sold back to the people traffickers by the guards. Things are so tense that the Libyans guarding them use live ammunition to control the crowd. Despite these protests, the traffickers came back, and many of the men pictured here were later taken away. The UN confirmed that people had indeed gone missing from the Kums detention center, and it expressed concern for their well-being. That concern is not misplaced, as these horrific images apparently demonstrate. Migrants sold back to the trafficking gangs are often tortured on camera. A gun pointed at his head, he's being burnt with molten plastic. Or these men being whipped and beaten. Women are not exempt. The videos are posted on social media, emojis included.
So you see, I know for some of you, when I said that this can be very grotesque and hard to watch, you probably see what I was saying. Our people are really suffering. And just to give a little more context that is not necessarily explained inside of this video. So of course, Africa is colonized. That's why we put so much emphasis on colonialism. We charge colonialism is because we have to understand colonialism is violence. Colonialism kills people. And when you look at the conditions that some African countries are facing right now, when you have babies who don't have any access to food, despite the fact that they're living on very minerally rich land, and these billionaires are taking all the money, taking all the resources out of the continent, you have people who are living in places where they can't give food for their babies, can't get food for their families, where they are literally trying to find a job, and they're also dealing with all these conflicts that are also being instigated by the colonial powers. All of these things are happening, and people are dying. There's famines, there's wars, conflicts, just a lot of violence. Now, when that happens as a result of colonialism, a lot of Africans are forced to flee. And that's why I don't like when people try to paint this like Wakanda view of go back to Africa. Yes, absolutely. You all know that I'm a big proponent of repatriation. I'm a big proponent of not just physical repatriation, but mental repatriation. You should leave this system mentally, leave this system, this colonized system. But at the same time, recognize that our people are not running to escape, to fall into these conditions because they just, want to get away from Africa. They're facing violent conditions depending on where you are, depending on who you are, depending on where you were born under this globalist capitalist economy. And it's choking the life out of many African communities. So a lot of people have tried to flee. They go north, and Libya is one of the countries where they try to go. Tunisia is another country, and also Egypt. And basically, those three countries border the Mediterranean. And obviously, on the other side of the Mediterranean are the European countries. So they're trying to get over the Mediterranean Sea into Europe. Now, this is a very dangerous journey, and many people have died. There are horrible videos of people drowning in the Mediterranean. Like you have a boat of like 100 people, and it's a little floaty, and the boat just, ends up going overboard, and all the people die, babies, very horrific things. And this is something that's been known to happen. Europe has been very, very adamant. They do not want these migrants inside of Europe. Now, they understand that they're creating the conditions for why these people are fleeing. They understand that. They understand it's their corporations. They understand it's their political manipulation of the processes on the African continent. They understand very well it's the systems they've put in place. It's the IMF and the World Bank, all of these systems that are in place. They understand that it really does come on them as to why Africans are feeling like they have to flee their own continent. But despite the fact that they understand that, despite the fact that they know this, they have no sympathy for the results of their actions. And that's why a lot of this Ukrainian sympathy is fake to me. I mean, we know very well that when it comes to who you show sympathy for, it's about, it's not about you just seeing someone that's dying. You see people dying all the time, but it's really about political maneuvering. We're meant to feel sympathy for the Ukrainians. We're meant to feel sympathy for them, even more than the Africans that are being brutalized inside of Ukraine. We're meant to feel sympathy for Ukraine. Ukraine is a country overrun by Nazis. We're meant to feel sympathy for them. So it's all calculated, and we should understand that if someone's trying to impress on you, you should feel more worse for these people than anyone else. That person is trying to maneuver the situation for their political upheaval, as they have done historically, right? So this whole issue with African migrants that are trying to flee the conditions of colonialism, the violent and grotesque conditions of colonialism, rather than welcome them, the same way that they welcome these Ukrainians that are fleeing the Russian invasion. No, they turn them back. They basically have made deals with different governments. We're going to get into details about this. One of the governments is Libya. Libya is essentially, they say, hey, you're just going to house these people in detention centers. Detention, like prison. You've seen a detention center that was visualized there. You're going to house these people in these detention centers, and the people, when they're in these detention centers, they basically fall prey to traffickers who are trying to enslave Africans. And the traffickers come in, and they basically come in and abduct people and sell them into slavery. So this is what's happening in Libya. And at the same time, Europe has also been contracting with other countries to try to find ways to overcome this migrant issue, because they look at it as a crisis, because they do not want at their doorstep the problems that they've created. They do not want Africans in Europe. So this is the story that we're going to talk about. We're going to just get more into details about this, about what Europe is doing, and more importantly, how Europe is playing this game with African migrants to really make it look like they'll do things and they'll make it look like aid and humanitarianism. But really, it's all under the precept that you cannot come here. We are going to continue to exploit Africa. We're going to continue to exploit your people, but you're not welcomed here, no matter how violent the system is that we put in place. And they put a lot of things inside of the international sphere, like we're trying to help people, but really it's really just a way to cover their tracks while they're going to fund people who are going to do horrible things to these African migrants who are trying to flee. So what I'm going to do right now, we're going to just talk about 2 African news stories, just 2 for today. Take a brief break, but the 2 I'm going to talk about is one, while this Ukrainian crisis is going on, Nigeria, of all countries, is having a fuel crisis, as well as other African countries. And then we're also going to talk about this Dominican Republic and Haiti having an issue as far as the Dominicans are trying to build a wall like Trump. So we're going to talk about that when we come back. Okay, so let's start with this Dominican Republic story. Just for some background, if you don't know, the Dominican Republic is basically, first of all, they're just as many of them are just as African as Haitians. Many of them have African descent. However, many of them historically have not embraced being African. Many of them shun it, and many of them will identify themselves with being Spanish. Identity crisis that you see inside of a number of Latino countries, right? So Dominicans really, really, really historically have hated, the fact that Haiti is so close, and a lot of Haitians could get to Dominican Republic, and Haiti obviously has always been under siege by the United States, and because of that, they have tried to flee to different places. Dominican Republic is one of them. So, like the white supremacists do, whenever a problem comes from the colonial system, what do? They say, let's do something to try to stop it. That's not going to deal with the actual issue. Let's not talk about what the United States is doing to Haiti. Let's build a wall and keep the Haitians out. A lot like Trump was saying, right? So let's go over here. It says, the government of the Dominican Republic has begun building a wall along its border with Haiti with an effort to stop irregular migration as well as smuggling of weapons, drugs, and goods. Dominican President Luis Abinader on Sunday attended an inauguration ceremony where he pushed a button that began the pouring of concrete into the foundations of what will be used to build the wall. Now, it says that the development comes amid a worsening political and economic situation in Haiti in the aftermath of the assassination of President Jovenel Moise last July. Amid a rising gang violence and political deadlock over the holding of elections, many Haitians have been crossing the border into the DR without documentation in search for work in agriculture or in construction industries. Although the two countries share the island of Hispaniola, they are worlds apart in terms of development. Haiti is one of the poorest nations in the Americas, while the Dominican Republic is a popular Caribbean tourist destination that has prospered in recent decades. So, of course, this is another reminder for us that, unfortunately, African people, we are basically put inside of an isolated position. Even among an island that essentially is shared by Haiti and the DR, they're still going to try to differentiate themselves. Even though they have African ancestry, they're going to try to differentiate themselves from the Haitians and basically make it so that the Haitians are going to deal with this issue on their own. Of course, the DR is not going to say anything about what's really causing the issues. The issues are not caused because Haitians are violent. Haitians are not violent people. Haitians are not people who like political unrest. Haitians are not people who like gangs. Haitians are people who have suffered at the hands of U.S. imperialism. That's really where you would have to put the blame on, put the emphasis on the United States to stop the pillaging of the Haitian people, the corporations that are constantly working to take from the island. Put the microscope on them, not on the people who are suffering. But of course, Dominican Republic is not going to do that because they themselves are part of this colonial globalist regime, and so they're going to work to not do anything about the situation except for to try to protect their own interests. So definitely keep our people in Haiti in your prayers, because they face a lot of discrimination, really. Those who are in Dominican Republic especially, they face a lot of discrimination, a lot of mistreatment. And unfortunately, when you're trying to flee these conflicts, this is the whole theme of this video. The colonial system has nothing to offer you as African people. We have to get that into our minds, that there's no other option but to fight. There's no other option but to face off, because trying to seek asylum, they don't look at us as asylum seekers. They look at us as gang leaders. They look at us as people trying to smuggle things in. They look at us as criminals. Always, anytime that there's a crisis, that we try to flee. And so Haitians have been dealing with this, you know, not just when they try to go to America, but also in the DR. So definitely keep them in your prayers. Now, this is just something I wanted to give a little perspective about when we talk about colonialism, because probably one of the most grotesque things about colonialism, I think, is when you have countries that are so rich with certain minerals and certain resources that they should be doing great. So I'll give you an example. In Russia right now, the United States, Europe, Africa, pretty much everywhere, right? The gas prices are going up. Yet the gas prices, people have been taking screenshots of the gas prices in Russia, which is an oil-rich nation. Or gas prices, I think it seems something like $1 or something like that, like very cheap, right? It should be that way in a country like Nigeria. Nigeria is a very oil-rich country. It's a country that really should be able to supply oil for all of Africa without even having to have difficulty. But Nigerians, amid this Ukrainian war, are facing surging fuel prices. So I'm just going to talk briefly about this. It says, chaos reigns at the petrol station in Nigeria's commercial hub, Lagos. Arguments break out and drivers blame blare their horns as they wait in a long queue that spills into the road, disrupting traffic. Motorists are spending hours waiting in hopes of filling their tanks before the fuel runs out. Again, an oil-rich country. They're trying to do this before the fuel runs out. Now, the fuel shortage in Nigeria has lasted more than weeks. It started after the federal government held back imports of fuel that was found to be substandard, causing scarcity at filling stations. Numerous independent fuel stations have increased the pump price of gasoline higher than the official 165 naira per liter. Many people hoard fuel to sell it at a higher price. The situation is part of a global problem. There are difficulties on the supply chain, on the supply and demand, and they're starting to increase. Global oil prices skyrocketed in 2021 following the recovery of the global economy from COVID-19. On top of this, Russia's invasion from Ukraine on February 24th has triggered a global spike over the concerns of a supply crunch. Now, this is the real problem right here. Nigeria's idle refineries. If Africa's going to want to be in an industrialized world, right? If you want to have cars, if you want to have buses, if you want to have airplanes, if you want to have heat and electricity and all these things, at the bare minimum, when you have the ability, you have the resources that could be used for that, you would want to use them, right? Well, this is what's happening in Nigeria. African countries are suffering high fuel prices and shortages as a result. This is ironically a recurring problem for Nigeria, Africa's biggest exporter of crude oil. Despite its massive oil sector, Nigeria imports almost all of its petroleum products. I want to emphasize and highlight this. Nigeria imports almost all of its petroleum products, partly because none of its country's 4 refineries work. To combine, these refineries would have had a capacity of 445,000 barrels a day. Authorities blame mismanagement and corruption, which is always to blame. So this is just some perspective for you all. Even in a country like Nigeria, where it's oil rich, even inside of many African countries that are oil rich, they're still suffering because of the reliance on importing from countries that are now going to war, right? And we're basically dependent on them. We have to do something if we're really going to be serious about having sovereignty and autonomy. But that's why a country like Nigeria, we should understand, is not free. No matter how nice it looks, no matter how many rich people live in Nigeria, no matter how good their movies are, we should understand the country is not free. Anytime that you don't even have control over the oil that's inside of your own country and you have to import it from people outside, that's just the prototypical example of being a colonized nation. So with that, we're going to get back into the story as we are talking about today. The story being basically the situation with African migrants, and we should understand the differences that we face as African people because of our status as a colonized people that the Ukrainians will never have to face, because essentially they're a part of the colonial European establishment. So we're going to take our time through this article. It's kind of a long article, but it hits on a number of things that I want you all to consider. So again, the whole thing that we're talking about today is the migrant crisis of Africans. Africans are fleeing Africa, not all of Africa, but many parts of Africa are so terribly oppressed. In fact, even some parts of Africa that many people like, you still see a lot of people fleeing them. Like a lot of people like going to places like Ghana or Tanzania. You still see a lot of people leaving the continent. I mean, I'm sure you've probably experienced people who have left because of lack of opportunity, whether you're inside of a Western country or not. And so this is something across the board. But this particular issue are people who are facing war, famine, and just violence because they live under the colonial system. So it says, after the migration crisis, how Europe works to keep Africans in Africa. That's right. Europe is working actively to keep Africans in Africa. Now, of course, I'm not advocating Africans go to Europe. I think a lot of them go to Europe because they're sold false dreams. You know, you hear of a lot of Africans thinking that they can go and get a job and have a good existence, you know, or have an education. You know, some of it is overblown, obviously, but we also know that the solution is not, you know, stay in your country and die. The solution is destroying the colonial system. That's what we have to turn our attention to. But it's important for us to understand that this is a real important aspect of colonialism that has been identified by the European powers, that they have to find a way to actively ensure that while they are pillaging the African continent, that they are still able to propel Africans from leaving, because they do not want that burden on them for even for their own actions. They don't want to have to deal with it. So migration from Europe, from Africa to Europe, has since the long summer of migration in 2015 been at the top of European political agenda, as right-wing parties have gained at the ballot box through their anti-migration rhetoric. The priority for most policymakers have been to look tough and above all to prevent an experience from ever happening again. To this, the European Union and the EU member states have devoted large amounts of resources to trying to keep people in Africa. One usually speaks of carrots and sticks, but given their sheer scale and a variety of interventions, it might be more appropriate to speak of bushels of the former and bundles of the later, as this feature demonstrates in great detail. An awful lot of activity has been going on. So let's scroll down some. We're going to just talk more about this migrant crisis. According to Pew Research Center in 2017, there was somewhere between 3.9 to 4.8 million unauthorized immigrants living in the member states of the European Union and the European Free Trade Area, up to 3.0 to 3.7 million in 2014. According to Eurostat, about 500,000 migrants registered for asylum in the EU member states in 2014. In both 2015, 2016, the number is almost 3 times that amount. Now, the issue when it comes to registering for asylum is, number one, they understand that technically, if you're talking about asylum, the amount of asylum seekers from the colonial system would easily outpace the European population. And that's why a big reason why you hear all these people talking about population control, whether it's the English Prince William, I think his name, talking about, oh, this is population control. Africa, we have to stop this population growth. Whether it's Bill Gates or different people like that, they understand that the catastrophe and the rate of the catastrophe as it's happening on the African continent and the increase in the African population is going to easily replace the European population if they allow them inside of Europe, right? So the spike has led to what is often referred to in the destination countries as a migrant crisis. The numbers involved, however, scarcely amounted to a crisis. As Pew points out, unauthorized immigrants still amount to less than 1% of the 500 million people living in the 27 EU states, 4 EFTA member states, and the UK. It's also important to note that new arrivals have dropped significantly since 2015, with over 600,000 people entering Europe irregularly, according to Frontex, the agency that controls the border of the European, I can't pronounce that word, area. So remember I told you to think about Poland, you know, early on when we were watching the video. It says Hungary, Poland, and this I never know how to pronounce this, Czech Republic, is that right? they rejected the EU Commission's co-hosting metric, a proposal for all member states to accept a proportional share of asylum seekers and close their borders to migrants. These same Polish, the same Hungarians, the same Czech Republican, I don't know what they're called. These same people who are so welcoming right now to Ukrainian refugees, and all of them are, like, I actually like Googled each and every one. You hear all these stories of not just Poland welcoming them, Hungary, Czech Republic. They're all welcoming Ukrainian refugees right now. But even the idea of allowing a small amount of these Africans who are fleeing colonialism into their country, they said absolutely no, right? Centrist politicians in other countries, recognizing that their electoral majorities were at risk, pushed for the EU to produce a fast and visible response. The first result was that in 2016, the EU-Turkey agreement, this promised Turkey $6 billion in financial assistance and a more liberal visa regime if Turkey successfully restricted the flow of people, many from Syria and Afghanistan, but also the Horn of Africa, into Greece. So this is a theme that you'll see throughout this article, is that the solution to basically the Europeans colonizing Africans and Africans trying to flee the African continent is not to say, hey, maybe we should, kind of let off of these people. Maybe we should stop trying to intervene or stop trying to finesse their politics. That's not the solution. The solution is to pay other countries, other countries, whether they're inside of the Middle East or in Africa, to do the work for them. Pay countries like Libya. We're also going to talk about Rwanda. Rwanda, if you don't know, is a major country that recently made some deals with the EU that they would help by taking some of these migrants that are trying to escape. So let's see. Scroll down some. It's a long article, but this is the part I wanted to talk about too. The hostile takeover of development aid. Yes, development aid. When you hear about all these countries pledging aid to Africa, and they make it seem like they're so giving, right? Well, one, we know that aid is a loaded term. Aid could be the actual money, but most times it's not. Most time it could be whether it's food or grain. It could be subsidies. It could be loans. They call loans aid. So anytime you hear aid, you should figure out what exactly they're talking about. But Europeans, a big way that they've tried to combat Africans from fleeing their position as being occupied, right, is to try to basically give them all of the things that they're asking for, but in a way that's going to undercut sovereignty. So Africans want food and water, obviously. Well, we're not going to give you your land back, but hey, here's some scraps that is going to keep you happy. Africans want the ability to make an economic living and to flourish. Well, we're not going to give you your economies back, but hey, you can take some job opportunities. Let's just give you some aid for that. That's really how they work, because they ultimately want to make sure that you're still dependent on them, make sure that you're not independent and sovereign, but at the same time, make sure that you don't think in your mind that you have to leave your country in order to get what you need. So the EU has long sought to repurpose development aid to tackle the root cause of migration. Job creation programs are, unsurprisingly, a prime example of this sort of work. Yet, while this sort of aid can be beneficial to the countries receiving it, the partnership framework makes clear from the EU's hope that the Europeans will benefit the most from its largest, mix of positive and negative incentives will be integrated into the European Union's development and trade policies to reward those countries willing to cooperate effectively with the EU on migration management and to ensure there are consequences for those who refuse. The primary mechanism for this work is the EU Emergency Trust for Africa. As of May 2020, 255. Oh my gosh, my numbers. I've told you I'm like 6. I'm trying to read, but I'm not there all the way today. 225 programs have received funding from this program. 26 countries inside of the Sahel and the Lake Chad region. So you can kind of get the picture. They're trying to do this as a way to undercut the migration crisis, right? Now, another way that they try is by using other African countries. So How has African states, regional agencies, and civil society balanced the aspirations of citizens and their own economic and political priorities? Well, they have done this in two ways. First, they've highlight Europe's role in creating many conditions that lead to migration, be it through colonialism, the violent exploitation of African labor and resources, or through military intervention and support for states suspected of human rights violations. A second reaction was to emphasize the divergence between European and African perceptions of and approaches to migration. While European actors have pushed a rhetoric of migration and refugee crisis and chosen to securitize migration, their African counterparts have stressed the importance of migration as a lever for development and argued for legal pathways for regular mobility, as well as the need for humanitarian response to irregular migration. So we understand, yes, these are conditions that are being created by Europe. But Europe's answer is never going to be to allow open borders, to allow the same type of movement, from Africa to Europe, because again, the idea is you're taking the resources with no mentality that these are actually for the people who are being colonized. It's literally a goal whenever you're a colonist, that the masses of the people who are suffering are not going to benefit from your exploitation. So they find undercut ways to make sure that you're still dependent on them, that you're not independent, and that they still are the ones who have power. Always is about power, and understand they can't have power if you are encroaching on their ability to colonize you. That's literally how their mind goes. So this, of course, became worse under the COVID-19 pandemic, as everything has for Africa become worse under the COVID-19 pandemic. Says the UN Commission for Africa has estimated that between 300,000 and 3.3 million Africans could die as a result of coronavirus before the end of 2020. That's a grave number, and I'm actually going to take off my camera for a second. So like I said, I'm sick, y'all. Let me just have a second to blow my nose, and I'll be right back. Okay, thank you for waiting. I'm gonna get through this, y'all. We're gonna get through this. All right, so a lot of people are expected to die because of COVID, because COVID obviously just worsened situations that were already there, right? So the impact of the economy could result in 27 million being pushed into extreme poverty. There's also growing evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic is changing attitudes of state and non-state actors, as well as wider population in countries along the three main migration routes. Now, one thing I do want to emphasize about the issue with the COVID-19 is that it's been anticipated that there's going to be a mass migration coming very soon out of the African continent. And if you remember, I covered this in the World Economic Forum. They're basically the policymakers of the global capitalists, right? They basically set the stage for this is how we're going to react to this crisis. And one thing that they've been very much saying is that when it comes to the continual exploitation, let's not stop the exploitation, but let's basically understand that people are going to be fleeing. So we have to find capacities and ways for these people to basically be able to become part, or to be basically to migrate. Now, I don't think that the intention is to allow them to migrate into Europe. I think a lot of the backdoor ways that are happening, like I mentioned, Rwanda is one of the countries. I think this is the way that they anticipate it, is finding countries that are willing to work with the EU, like Libya, which is no longer what it used to be, like Rwanda, which is basically trying to appeal to the European oligarchs, like all of these countries that are sold out to the interests, but might want to do a favor to the European Union, and basically have them put their people in camps as a way to keep them controlled. Not allow these people to become integrated into European society, because again, that was not the intention of colonizing them, so that they could also be a part of the system that's colonizing them. So it says it's too early to predict the overall impact of COVID-19 on migration from Africa to Europe. However, given a stark disparity in wealth and hence life chances for those who are living on the two continents, the fundamental conditions persist. While the externalization of border security into Africa and purely a situation in Libya have contributed to reducing flows since 2017, this is liable to be temporary for the EU's political dilemma caused by unauthorized migration, not only from Africa, but also Syria, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, is likely to deepen. And that's really the takeaway from this particular article. Now, I want to follow up more with this issue of Rwanda. You all know I'm very critical of people who try to act like Rwanda is the destination that we should try to aspire to be like, because we should understand that Rwanda really does work hand in hand with the colonial system. Historically, you know, when it comes to Kagame, he basically has, let me go back here. Let's see, I think this is the article. Here we go. Kagame has a history of trying to appease the European system, because that's literally what he has to do. Let me make sure you all can see my screen, because I had to go from a different route than I usually do. So if you could let me know if you see, yeah, it looks like you can see my screen. Yeah. I think you all can see it. So, okay. So let's go back to this article. I want you all to just put more emphasis on what Rwanda is doing that it shouldn't be doing as far as the African continent. Now, Europe keeps asylum seekers at a distance, this time in Rwanda, okay? For 3 years, the EU has been paying other countries to keep asylum seekers away from a Europe replete with populist and anti-migrant parties. It has paid Turkey billions to keep refugees. We talked about that. It has funded the Libyan Coast Guard. We talked about that. It has set up centers in Niger to process asylum seekers. And is even in, if they ever make it that far, most don't. Even as that arms lift network comes under criticism on humanitarian grounds, it is so overwhelmed that the European Union is now seeking to expand as the bloc aims to buttress an approach that has drastically cut the number of migrants crossing the Mediterranean. It is now preparing a deal, this time with Rwanda, to create yet another nod that it hopes will help alleviate some of the mounting strains on its outsourcing network. So just to, again, ask all the Kagame lovers, you know, why would Kagame make this deal with Europe? To basically help them as they're trying to control their colonial situation. They basically want to make sure that, regardless of what they do in Africa, they'll still be able to control the resources without having to pay, without having to give anything to the African people. This is like reparations. This is reparations presently. This is all of the issues when it comes to payment back of the resources. They don't want to even give an opportunity to have to give Africans back what Africans are entitled to, really. So critics say that the Rwanda deal will deepen a morally perilous policy, even as it underscores how precarious the European Union's teetering system for handling the migrant crisis has become. Tens of thousands of migrants and asylum seekers have been trapped in Libya, where a patchwork of militias control detention centers, and migrants are sold as slaves in order to prostitution, kept in places so packed that there is not even enough floor space to sleep on. Scroll down some. So this shows you right here, I think it's an interesting number. This is 2014. This is when a lot of Africans were basically making it to Europe. Now, I think there's more Africans fleeing at the African continent today than back then. But you see right now that the bar has gone way down in recent times. A lot of this is because of the militaristic ways that Europe has been pushing Africans from entering Europe. Really, the Libyan Coast Guard has been blocking the vast majority of people. And so, to their knowledge, the arrivals has been a lot less than what they can count, you know? So let's scroll down and talk a little bit about Rwanda. On the African front in particular, in the Mediterranean, the agreements have come at lower financial costs, but arguably at a higher moral one. Brussels' funding of the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept the migrant boats before they reach international waters has been extremely effective, but has only apprehended migrants vulnerable to abuses in a North African country with scant central governance, at the mercy of an anarchic at war state of militia rule. A handful are resettled directly out of Libya, and a few thousand are transferred to the United Nations Refugee Agency. to a processing center, and understand that the United Nations, what their goal is to basically shield the colonists from responsibility as well. So whenever you see all these United Nations aid or development or refugee areas, they understand that their goal, the whole purpose of the United Nations humanitarian missions, is to literally make sure that the responsibility of the Europeans are evaded, because they're going to pretend to be the lovers of the people, and they're going to pretend to want to do things for the people under the guise of humanitarian aid, but it's really about control of the population. So sorry, let me scroll back up. Okay, with many European member states refusing to accept any asylum seekers, Brussels and increasingly President Emmanuel Macron of France have appealed to those willing to take in a few who are deemed especially vulnerable, as Italy has continued to reject migrant rescue vessels from docking at its port and threatened to impose fines of up to €1 million, 1.1 million, on those who defy it. Mr. Macron has spearheaded an initiative among European members to help resettle migrants rescued in the Mediterranean. 8 nations have joined them. But ultimately, it's a drop in the bucket. An estimated 500,000 migrants live in Libya, and just 51,000 are registered with the United Nations agency. 5,000 are held in squalid and unsafe detention centers. I'm trying to find the part where they talk specifically more about Rwanda. Let me actually just Control F. Okay, here we go. It's now preparing to finish a deal, this time in Rwanda, to create another node that it will help alleviate some of the mounting strains on its outsourcing networks. Critics say the Rwanda deal will deepen a morally perilous policy. I've already spoken about that, I think. So I think we actually covered everything. So to bring it back to the issue when it comes to the fake outrage about the Ukrainian crisis that many people are willingly engaging in, and African people as well, we have to be willing to hold Europeans responsible for the things that they are doing to African people. If you want to show sympathy towards the Ugandans and understand, not the Ugandans, the Ukrainians, for the situation that they are put in because of this invasion, understandable. But if you're not going to also point to the fact that many African people are suffering under the same colonial system that has oppressed them for over 400 years, and there's no letting up at this particular point, if you're not interested in focusing on that as well, then understand that you are ignoring your own people while you're hyper-focusing on helping or saving people who many times are not even allied with you, many times don't even see the humanity in you. So if anything, if anyone is going to point the finger at anyone, it has to be us pointing a finger at Europe. I laugh every time that I hear these European countries criticize Russia. I laugh every time because I know that they are complete hypocrites. You're going to criticize Russia. You have Israel. You have so many other countries that are doing horrible atrocities, and yet you're criticizing Russia for invading Ukraine. Meanwhile, you continue to invade Africa. Even if it's not a formal invasion, maybe you're getting permission from the African puppets. You're still working to actively undermine African sovereignty. So this is why we have to continue to make sure that we understand who our enemies are and don't get confused. Don't get confused with the news that they're trying to get you to focus on Ukraine and not on yourself. Our enemies are these colonists. Our enemies are these neo-colonialists. And until we figure out really how we're going to unseat their power over the African continent, then we're basically abandoning our own cause. And so hopefully I was able to outline for you that we can't abandon our cause in place of trying to follow the mainstream narrative. We have to be just as awakened to the struggles of the African people. We have to be just as abhorred to the struggles of the African people. And we have to highlight that if we don't gain power and sovereignty, if we don't unleash ourselves from this colonial system, our people will continue to die, continue to suffer insurmountably, because again, our people are weakened position, and we're powerless. So I hope I was able to draw that parallel for you all. I hope that you all enjoyed. I'll post the articles and the videos that I posted right after this video. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next video.